I'd like to welcome everyone to this presentation. I'm Chris Daly. I'm the Vice President of Sales at Primary Intelligence. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Ron Sadoff. Ron?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ron Sadoff. I'm part of the product development team here at Primary Intelligence.
And we look forward to presenting you with information on producing ROI through your competitive intelligence efforts. So today, as we start, let's look at a couple of situations where a couple of different methods could be employed, and let's look at the ability of each of these situations to potentially provide ROI. So first of all, we have a scenario where a sales team is not performing as well as expected. In fact, they're getting beat consistently by a competitor. Ron, what are a couple of things that could be done in this situation?
Well, if you look at the slide, we have two different situations, or two different ways of doing the CI. And both of these are ones that have either been thought of or ones that have been requested by a client. If you look at column A, this is looking at how to answer this question, how does our sales team do better, by looking at the strengths and weaknesses of the sales team by dealing with the people who have dealt with the sales team. In other words, either the sales representatives themselves or clients, prospects. And the purpose of that is to identify areas in real time and real life where they had strengths and where they had weaknesses. In column B, this is another way that a company has tried to approach this question, and that is looking at the competitor sales team in terms of their compensation, what their salary is, what their commission plan is, and also what kind of revenue they bring in, which is much more focused on the competitor rather than the sales team itself.
Okay. So in this situation in column B, where would you go to get this kind of information?
That's the difficult part.
Okay.
And like I said, this is actually a real case scenario where a client asked Primary Intelligence to do this kind of work. And our response was, how do we get this information in terms of, do you go to the competitor sales representatives and say, how much money do you make? Of course, the answer is going to be, I'm not going to tell you.
Who are you? And yeah, right, exactly. Okay, so let's take a look at another situation. Number 2, your company sells an ERP software solution, and for the purpose of this, replace that with whatever you do. You need to know more about a specific competitor's offering. What are a couple things you could do here, Rob?
Well, once again, we have two different columns here that have two different approaches, one of which obviously has a better chance of succeeding. Column A is interviewing various users of ERP software, different systems, trying to find out what the strengths and weaknesses of those systems are, and from that, kind of getting an insider's view into what the best practices are, in other words, how they use the ERP systems to help them, so that you get a really good sense of what your clients are looking for and what kind of features they need. Column B, which once again a client has asked Primary Intelligence to do it this way before thinking it through, was hiring us to actually buy an ERP system with our own money.
A pretty minor investment, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
And then basically test it out. And since we don't use an ERP system, the likelihood of that succeeding was not very high.
Yeah.
And then basically give them a list of features and functions and what it did and what it didn't do, which they probably could have gotten by looking at a pamphlet.
Okay. So in both of these situations, companies have real problems and real intelligence needs.
Mm-hmm.
But the funny thing is, the solution that they come up with is not really thought out is this going to help us with more business? Is it going to generate more revenue for our company? Are we going to be more efficient?
In both cases, column B, those were probably thought of as being, just kind of a reaction to, well, we need to find out about X. But it's not really optimized either in terms of getting it done, how easily it can be done, or in terms of what kind of benefits will we get from the results.
Yeah. So let's look at a couple of obstacles to ROI. What are the things that stand in the way of intelligence making a difference within a company? And the first thing that we've found is that much of the competitive intelligence that's generated, we would call crisis-inspired competitive intelligence. We just lost to who? How come that deal didn't come through? Why did our account just slip out of our hands? Find out now. Well, once again, you're looking at a tragedy in the rearview mirror rather than being strategically focused on how can we improve our competitiveness in the future. Yes, there are things that can be learned in that situation, but management by crisis is rarely an effective method. Second, lack of executive sponsorship. If executives are not willing to accept the information, either because they don't believe it or it doesn't come in a form that's palatable to them, they will not make changes based on that information. And if there are no business changes, what's the point of gathering the information in the first place? And then third, criteria have to be developed which will allow you to prioritize and gather information that will make a difference. If not, you're going to be chasing everything under the sun. You will end up with piles of information, but you won't have anywhere to go with that. So where is the return on investment in the data? Turns out that you can conduct competitive intelligence in a number of ways, but some of them are not as practical as others, and some of them may not really provide that ROI you're looking for. Espionage, it's a wonderful spy game. It's a wonderful way to think, wow, what if we knew this about our competitor? What if we could find out their next move, next year's technology base, what they're going to be charging in the future for these new services? Is this market going to open up to us only, or are they moving there too? Great questions, but very hard to get answers. Not worth it in many cases. A second approach, a very common approach in competitive intelligence, is the library approach. Let's study everything. Let's store everything. Let's archive everything. Let's update everything. We have continual processes that are churning lots and lots of information. But Ron, in the end, what is the end result of this type of an approach?
A lot of paper.
Okay.
A lot of paper that's hard to find actual nuggets of useful information.
Okay. And the problem is, again, where's the ROI? If you have a lot of information, you are perhaps ahead of the competition, at least in your efforts. But how do you value that information, and how do you assign a value to it? And in the end, if somebody were to come to you as manager of this type of information, if they were to ask you specifically, what in this library of information will help us win 5% more business next year or increase our market share by 10%, how do you go about answering that other than, here, read this and hope? So, if you can't say, this is going to provide us with additional business, higher account retention, more operational efficiencies, or a greater market space, again, how do you answer that question of ROI? So, as you review your competitive intelligence initiative, there are two main questions that should be asked. One is, how practical is it to obtain the information? And number two, can I create ROI with the intelligence? And if you look at the quadrant we've provided, the upper left shows very high ROI information that would provide you with the ability to compete more effectively. But it's impractical to get this kind of information that would not be readily available to your company. It's an interesting square of the quadrant, but it's probably not the best to be in. The bottom left, that's the information that is impossible to get and possibly has no ROI. Wouldn't spend any time there at all. In our experience, the bottom right is probably where most companies spend most of their time. Collecting lots of information, this library approach we've discussed, archiving everything you can. And there is a place for crawling for information online. There are clipping services, account profiling, and these types of research. But in a lot of cases, the upkeep of this information is busy work. If you can't address the question of how is this going to provide ROI, it is going to fit into that quadrant. But the upper right, the high ROI potential, is the kind of information that can answer both questions. What information is readily available to our company and has very high potential to provide us with return on investment, bring in new revenue, help us develop new relationships, and keep our current accounts with us. Looking at the practicality side, what good is the data if you can't get it? We've listed a small list of information types that are very common in competitive intelligence. Those that are on the low side, if the information is trade secret, insider information, if it's inside your competitor's company and that's the only place it resides, very low likelihood of getting that type of information. The high side, if you can talk to your customers, you probably can get good information, and you'd be surprised at how much they know about the competition and how much they're willing to tell you. Again, you can look at your competitors' customers. They also know about their vendor, they know about your competitor, and they're probably pretty likely to share some of that information with you under the right circumstances. channel partners and agents are also a fairly good source of information. And there are sources like public domain, internet, and such, which can provide tons of information. But again, you have to run it against the other idea of, is that going to provide us with ROI? So as we develop criteria to evaluate whether this will provide ROI, it's really very simple. Most of the time, we're looking for information that will provide more top-line revenue. Can we create more business? We're looking for information that will improve the bottom line. Where can we be more efficient operationally? And finally, applicability. Because if we can't act on the data, then it's not as useful as we might hope. It's not going to provide you with the ROI you're looking for. So Ron, summarize, if you would, a few of the tips about collecting this type of information.
Well, really, based on what we've been talking about, some of the things you just need to keep in mind is that you should really plan your CI and focus it, have a strategy for it, rather than simply reacting to it. If all you're doing is reacting to flaming meteors, then you're never really going to get to the answers that will be meaningful over time. You'll just be doing the short term rather than the long term. Second, you want to make sure that the CI you find becomes must-have. This will help you get executive buy-in. This will help you get a lot of usage of your information throughout an organization, which means you have to find information that's going to be useful to other people rather than just, oh, that's nice to know, oh, that's interesting. You have to find the useful information and make sure it gets to the right people so that it will move forward. You want to try to avoid the busy work, like you mentioned, which is simply getting information for information's sake. Realize that a small amount of information that is useful and pointed towards answering a specific question is going to be much more useful than loads and loads of reports that are just numbers that aren't going to be used. And finally, take the time to determine what you want to investigate before you spend your resources trying to investigate it. This is really, the focus is really a main point of all of this, which is all of us have limited resources. And the resources that we have should be used for those things that are going to give us the greatest benefit. And CI is a perfect example of that. Take your resources, whether it's your interviewing time, whether it's your own personal time, whether it's the amount of money you have to spend on a third party, and use it effectively by saying, I want to learn these things that are going to give me the greatest benefit.
So when primary intelligence looks at competitive intelligence, we have a goal, and our goal is to position your company more competitively. We want you to win more battles and identify the value drivers that reduce the commoditization. And the reason I say that is because many people feel like there's a lot of price pressure, there are a lot of competitors, and the landscape is very difficult. We know, however, that in the majority of cases, people don't buy strictly on price. It's a value decision. And how do we know this? Through the tens of thousands of interviews that we've conducted, the majority of those have ended up with the low price not being the winning vendor or the selected vendor. So our goal is to help you to understand better what are the value drivers that cause you to gain competitive advantage, and to help balance that voice that comes from your sales group saying, we're losing on price, we're losing on price, and we're losing on price. It's not all about the price. And the methods that we use are to measure your performance against the competition, leverage that information and help you understand their tactics and the value differentiators. Then we use our predictive analytics to discover the key drivers that will help you to increase your competitiveness. And once we've identified the key drivers, now we can create a competitive intelligence plan that does meet an ROI criteria very strongly. An impact-based competitive intelligence model that we use is three-part. The first thing we do is measure your company's performance in your product performance, the perception of your sales team, and the overall perception of your company. We know that purchase decisions are not made based on one simple thing. Prospects evaluate your company, your sales team, and your product all together to decide the value that it's going to provide. The second thing we do is use our predictive modeling to analyze those measurements. It's not just enough to know where you're strong and where you're weak, but we have to find out where does your positive performance correlate with your wins? Where does your negative performance correlate with account defection? How can we identify those areas that are most important? We use the predictive model to figure out what will provide the maximum benefit. And once we have that at a high degree of statistical precision, we then try to answer the question of how. We know what to improve. How can we improve that most effectively so that we can make our biggest gains and gain the biggest ROI with our competitive intelligence?
One thing to keep in mind with this is that this is a really good example of how you use competitive intelligence to refine itself.
Okay.
If you look at the 3 steps, the first step is getting the basic information about how did our company perform in these particular areas, which would be very useful on its own. But in order to help refine its applicability, we then go into further detail by looking and doing the analysis to find out which ones have the greatest impact, which is a pretty large step over the first step. But we go even farther, and this can go with any kind of CI strategy, whether it's internal or through a third party, and that is, now that you have some of that information, use that as a guide for focusing your future CI. And in this case, what is done is we look at the ones that have the greatest impact, and then say, all right, let's do some further research and find out how do we improve our performance in those particular areas based off of the performance of those companies that did the best in it.
So Ron, let's imagine for a minute that we had done some competitive intelligence for your company, all right? Let's imagine we've done a number of interviews, and after we have aggregated the data, we've found that in this list of influencers, you have the following ratings. So for example, at the top, your overall solution cost on a 1 to 10 scale, where 1 is poor and 10 is excellent, your company is rating an 8.1 overall. Well, that feels pretty good on a scale of 1 to 10, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But it's not enough. You need to know where you stand in relation to the competition. And it turns out that against the combined competition, you're trailing by a full point on this 1 to 10 scale. So in other words, the competition is rating a 9.1 right now. Okay. The second one down is understanding needs, an 8.5. Again, a very high score, relatively speaking, on a 1 to 10 scale, but you're still trailing the competition by 0.7. And as you can see, this table is organized from biggest negative gap, or in other words, your biggest competitive weakness, down to your biggest positive gaps, which would be your biggest competitive strengths. Down at the bottom of the chart, we have company size, ability to do demonstrations, 7.6 and 7.7 respectively, but 0.8 of a gap and 0.7 of a gap advantage in these areas. These are where you are outperforming the competition consistently.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, let's imagine that we had this data for you, and you had to prioritize, because in most cases, everyone has to prioritize. If you could only work on 2 or 3 of the points in this data, where would you start?
Well, I'd probably start at the top of the list, because those are the places where the competition is apparently beating us.
Okay.
So I'd be looking at, how can we make our costs appear to be less than our competitors? How can we better understand the needs of our customers? How can we show that we have a complete solution set? I would probably not spend a whole lot of time at the ones that had high ratings, but we also were doing better than the competition. Because obviously we're doing well there, so all we have to do is basically tread water there.
Okay.
Keep doing what we're doing would be fine. So things like demonstration, industry experience would be ones that I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time worrying about.
Okay. And this approach makes perfect sense. It feels good to fix the weaknesses, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we're trailing, that must be bad. And that's true. We all have that sense of wanting to fix what's broken. But let me ask you this. Let's imagine that you wanted to start with number 1, number 2, number 3, overall solution cost. If you were to take that rating from an 8.1 to a 9.1, you spend money on marketing, you create additional value, you do other things, maybe you do adjust the price, or whatever it is that causes that perception to increase. Let's imagine you take that 8.1 to a 9.1, and now you're on par with the competition. After spending all of that time and money and energy, how much is your win rate going to change?
I'm not sure. All I know is that we're now at the same level as our competition.
Okay. So we hope that it's going to improve. We hope that we'll gain more business, but we don't have any indicator at the moment that that's going to be the case, right?
Mm-hmm.
Other than gut feel. Okay. Same thing with understanding needs. Take that 8.5 to a 9.5, and how much is your win rate going to increase?
Don't know.
Talking about your current accounts, if you were to take your complete solution set rating from an 8.5 to a 9.5, how much would your account retention increase?
I don't know.
Okay, so I understand. Primary intelligence knows that it's not enough to do strengths and weaknesses alone. That is good information, but there's a better way to review this. On this next slide, a new column has been added called the impact column. The data no longer is sorted from biggest weakness to biggest strength, but now in descending order of impact. And the information that we're able to provide you through our predictive analytics is very simple. You can see that the top of the table now is product knowledge, which was number 15 before. There's a slight competitive advantage there. The rating was 7.7, and it's a half point better than the competition. But what we're telling you is that if you were to improve that rating of 7.7 to an 8.7, you would expect your win rate to increase by 5.7%. The same thing with industry experience. If you were to take that 8.2 to a 9.2, you already have a very significant strength. But if you were to improve that 8.2 by 10%, we would expect your win rate to increase by 4.8%. And you can see that if you looked at the top 4 or 5 influencers, you could realize a 15 to 20% increase in your win rate with a 10% increase in each of those performance areas. This is the way that primary intelligence helps to identify those areas of competitive performance that have highest impact. It's not completely based on strengths and weaknesses. It's based on correlation with your ability to get the results you're looking for and the what-if scenario of, if I made improvements, what would happen? Now, something I'd point out is lower on the chart, we can see some influencers that have 0 impact ratings. And I've had people say, come on, professionalism, 0 impact, that has a great impact on the sale. And absolutely, it does. But just to be clear, we're saying that if you were to improve your performance in professionalism, we would not expect an increase in your win rate. In other words, maintain, but don't spend your resources improving that point right there. Once these 4 or 5 top influencers have been identified by impact score, now it's time to figure out what should we do. How should we go about making the biggest and most efficient gains in our performance? And it's very easy to look at product knowledge and compare your performance with each of your specific competitors. We can see that against competitor 1, you have a competitive strength. Competitor 2 and competitor 3, nominal strength and weakness. But competitor 4, you are being outperformed consistently by competitor 4 by over 10%. Well, let's go back to those same people that evaluated you versus competitor 4. Let's understand, what did competitor 4 do that earned them a 9, that earned you a 6 in product knowledge? How is competitor 4 expressing product knowledge so much better than you, and what would it take for you to get to a 7 or an 8 or a 9? We can do some very simple questioning to understand what the competitive differences are in these areas of high impact, and then create a recipe that will help us to increase our performance. In other words, we're going to discover their best practices and adopt those as our own and perform at their level in areas of high impact. The second idea, industry experience. Competitor 2 is outperforming us. Again, what is competitor 2 doing to display industry experience at a level that's so much better than us? If you take this type of approach, you're going to be studying the competitors with superior ratings. You can determine their best practices, and you can eventually beat the competition with their own strengths.
And once again, this is just a great example of focusing your competitive intelligence through your competitive intelligence. Because this second set of questioning is all based upon what was found in the first studies.
So how does this provide ROI? Well, it's pretty easy. Let's imagine that you're a $1 billion company. You can look at the win-loss, you can look at account retention. If you know what percentage of your revenue comes from both sides, you can do your own math. If you were to increase your win rate or your retention rate by 10% based on the information from your competitive intelligence program, you would be generating $14 million in new revenue in wins, and you would be generating almost $49 million in new revenue in account retention. That would indicate, with a reasonably priced competitive intelligence program, a 63-time ROI in win-loss and 255-time ROI in account retention. For every dollar spent on the win-loss side, you would expect to harvest 63, which is a pretty good way to be the company hero. In conclusion, you should be executing your competitive intelligence to produce ROI. Evaluate the practicality of gathering the data you need, estimate the potential to increase your top or bottom line revenues, and gain executive sponsorship. And use a scientific approach. Measure your key competitive performance factors, determine what will make the biggest difference, and then show how to make the improvements. If you can present data in that format, your executives will understand it, they will be able to have a higher chance of incorporating it, and your competitive intelligence program will produce ROI.